Despite the intimidating looking handout, I think my argument is very simple and straightforward, but please stop me at any point for questions of clarification. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the human right to subsistence, where subsistence just means the basic necessities of life, so adequate food, water, and so on. The international poverty line is defined as the level of poverty beneath which a minimally nutritionally adequate diet and essential non-food requirements are not affordable. So it's those that are falling below this poverty line that are the people who don't enjoy the right to subsistence. Now, this has been widely ratified and affirmed as a fundamental human right. And many theorists and practitioners have argued that it has the same moral standing as so-called first-generation negative human rights, such as the right not to be tortured and so on. But nevertheless, it's a striking feature that even these theorists don't tend to apply the term violation to the persistence of severe poverty. And I'll basically argue that we should see the persistence of severe poverty as a human rights violation. In a nutshell, what I'll argue is that the two main accounts of assigning responsibility for a human rights violation don't apply to the complex causal chains that lead to the persistence of severe poverty. And while it's very important to avoid watering down the force of the concept of a human rights violation, it's also important to avoid arbitrarily constraining our concept of a human rights violation so as to rule out ex ante its applicability to really complicated social contexts. So with these two criteria for an account of a human rights violation in mind, to retain the moral force of the concept and to avoid arbitrarily restricting it to certain social contexts, I'm going to give some morally minimal sufficient conditions for constituting a human rights violation, and then argue that the persistence of severe poverty meets those sufficient conditions. So the structure of the paper is that I'll begin by just sketching some empirical claims, just very briefly, so that it's clear what's a philosophical argument, what's an empirical assumption. I'll then very briefly outline these two main accounts of responsibility for human rights violations, the interactional and the institutional accounts. And then I'll argue for a category of structural violations. Okay, so some empirical claims. And I hope that these are all fairly uncontroversial. I mean, what's quite striking about this debate is that there hasn't been a lot of agreement about empirical claims about severe poverty, and yet nevertheless an unwillingness to apply the concept of human rights violation to severe poverty. Okay, so the first empirical claim is that countries that are currently affluent were in their history enriched in part through the theft of natural and social resources, in the form of slavery, in the form of colonialism under a system of international law where countries were held to be both legally and morally entitled to the resources in another country. And in addition, this access to very cheap supply of natural resources enabled countries that are now affluent to industrialize at a rate that involved using up what we now know is vastly more than an equitable share of the Earth's absorptive capacity. So although there have been, of course, many different accounts that have been given of the Lockean proviso, it's pretty uncontroversial that this was violated. The second claim is that economic structures, to some extent, endure across generations. Of course, there are discontinuities, but there are also continuities. So the first conclusion is that some of the current wealth enjoyed by affluent countries was unjustly acquired. It can be traced back to theft. And actually rightfully belongs to countries that are now suffering severe poverty. And this isn't an argument for that we should be feeling guilty. It's simply what I take to be a minimal claim that you can't rightfully inherit stolen property. The second empirical claim is that some features of the operation of global social institutions contribute to the level of severe poverty. For example, the international resource privilege, which allows dictators basically to sell off the resources of their country and use the money for weapons and so on, even though it's entirely predictable that the resources will be stolen from the people to whom it rightfully belongs. And furthermore, those people are actually going to be harmed by the resources that rightfully belong to them because the money will be used for weapons with which to oppress them and so on. And the third empirical claim is the feasibility of avoiding severe poverty in light of just the current overall level of global resources. Okay, so I think this gives a strong prima facie case for the claim that both the positive and the negative duties correlative to the human right to subsistence are being violated. Much severe poverty should be attributed to violations of the negative duty not to deprive people of the means of subsistence. And responsibility for that violation can't be plausibly confined to the right holder's own government. Some of the responsibility is shared by the international community. And secondly, if we think about the positive duties correlative to the right to subsistence, responsibility for that has to be shared by the international community if we want to take it to be a fundamental human right, given that in many poor countries, the level of resources internal to that country is not sufficient to provide the means of subsistence to all the citizens. Okay. So in light of that, I think it is fairly puzzling why the notion of human rights violations isn't applied. So I'm now going to turn to the two dominant accounts of responsibility for human rights violations. And the first is the traditional, straightforward, interactional account where paradigmatic human rights violations are acts of torture, assault, and so on, where you've got one agent directly inflicting a severe harm on a particular victim. Now, clearly, that's not going to be applicable to the negative duty not to deprive people of the means of subsistence, because the causal chains that result in any particular farmer being pushed below the subsistence level involves the interaction of the behavior of a vast number of agents in hugely complicated structural processes. Okay, so let's turn to the main other account of human rights violations, which is the institutional account. And this moves away from taking human rights to be claims directly against individuals to avoid inflicting severe harms, towards taking human rights to be claims against social institutions. So on this model, responsibility for human rights violation lies with an official agent of a coercively imposed institutional order. This is the conception of human rights violations that's dominant in current international law, according to which the role of human rights is to protect citizens against the worst kinds of outrageous acts performed by their own government. The United Declaration of Human Rights there's widespread consensus, largely motivated in the aftermath of the Nazi Holocaust, and does refer to barbarous acts which shocked the conscience of humankind. And the paradigmatic international trial is still based on that Nuremberg model, where you've got individual leaders charged with responsibility for acts of mass slaughter and mistreatment of civilian populations. So paradigmatic human rights violations on this institutional view are state crimes. And this conception is applied to the human right to subsistence, according to which it's held to be, in the first instance, a claim against the right holder's own government. The responsibility of the international community is limited to being that of fulfilling a backup responsibility, right, to enforce or facilitate the primary duty to respect the right. On that view, the international community, it's ruled out ex ante that it could actually be responsible for a human rights violation, because the addressee of the right responsible for respecting it or violating it is limited to the right holder's own government. Now, the problem with that model, if we focus on the positive duties correlative to the right to subsistence first, is that for many poor countries, the universal fulfillment of the positive duty to make sure that everyone has access to the means of subsistence is simply not a practicable demand. It's not plausible to hold someone to be violating a right if that addressee simply wasn't in a position to fulfill the duty. And for precisely that reason, the ICESR doesn't designate as a human rights violation any state which fails to provide the means of subsistence for all its citizens. Rather, the right to subsistence is understood as progressively realizable, and countries are to take steps towards realizing it in light of the level of resources they have available to them. And the next move in the debate is that, well, then the right to subsistence isn't a genuine human right. It's just an aspiration, it's a goal, and so on. The conclusion isn't drawn that the right to subsistence is a fundamental, if we do take the right to subsistence to be a fundamental human right, then it's going to be a claim against the rest of humanity. So the relevant level of resources is going to be global and not the level internal to poor countries themselves. So that's one thing I find very odd about both about current international law and the discussion about the human right to subsistence. So just to sum up, the dialectic tends to go, well, the right to subsistence is not, that the duty to respect it is not realizable, therefore it's an aspiration, and we shouldn't include the right to subsistence into the corpus of fundamental human rights. That just waters down their force. But there's a very different conclusion you can draw, which is simply that the right to subsistence is a claim against global resources. And then it would be a practicable demand. Turning to the negative duties imposed by the right to subsistence, I think it's also a very shallow analysis to say that the violator is always just going to be confined to the right holder's own government. I mean, for one thing, that doesn't take any account of the historical context underpinning the current levels of severe poverty and so on. And it, again, ignores completely any possible causal role by the international community. Okay, so turning to Thomas Pogge's account, he's a very rare advocate of the claim that the persistence of severe poverty should actually be classified as a human rights violation. He accepts the institutional analysis of responsibility for human rights violations, and what he argues in a nutshell is that there's a coercively imposed global institutional order, the operation of which is responsible for most existing severe poverty. So, in a way, he goes to the opposite extreme. The operation of what he calls the global institutional order is actually responsible for depriving millions of people of the means of subsistence, and therefore responsible for 18 million poverty-related deaths each year. And he actually does draw a comparison between between poverty-related deaths and the Nazi Holocaust. He does say that it's not intentional in the same way, but in terms of the scale, it's much more severe. Okay, so on the handout, I've got a quotation from Thomas Pogge. Right, so on his institutional analysis, direct responsibility for the persistence of severe poverty ultimately lies with official agents of this coercively imposed global institutional order. So there's a quotation: responsibility for decisions that foreseeably result in millions of avoidable deaths rests in the first instance with the politicians and negotiators who make them. Such people have knowingly committed some of the largest human rights violations ever committed that the world has ever seen. And he actually draws a comparison between these official agents of the global social institutional order and Nazi war criminals. He takes the role of individual citizens to be analogous to the role of bystanders in Nazi Germany, who were benefited by the theft of property from the Jews and so on, and looked the other way. Now, not surprisingly, perhaps, his argument has been extremely controversial. And just to, I don't want to go into long exegesis about it, but I just want to highlight some of the main objections. The first is simply that he exaggerates the extent of the role played by global social institutions in the persistence of severe poverty. And I think that's a real shame, because I think his argument ends up being dismissed because he makes such a strong claim about the extent of the role played by the global institutional order as opposed to domestic social institutions. And I don't think you need anything like that strong a claim to get very radical conclusions. I mean, even if you were to take the role of global social institutions to be fairly minor, I mean, even a minor role in 18 million poverty-related deaths each year is something that presumably should be taken somewhat seriously. The other objection, well, the second objection is that the institutional model he's giving just doesn't really apply to what he calls the global institutional order, because global social institutions just don't have the authoritative decision-making structure of domestic social institutions. They function more as places where, you know, different countries can negotiate with each other. So you can't draw that parallel with, you know, specific momentous policy decisions made by members of the Nazi Party to implement the final solution. And that brings us to the third principal objection, which is that it's not possible to pinpoint specific intentional policy decisions made by these official agents that are plausibly describable as inflicting severe poverty. So what I want to do is come up with a more plausible, I mean, inspired by Pogge, but come up with a more plausible defense of some of his core arguments. There are two important innovations in Pogge's approach. One is that he does shift the focus to away from just looking at domestic social institutions. And the other is that he also shifts the focus towards looking at the combined effects of normal, everyday, seemingly innocuous behavior. You know, our day-to-day economic activities can actually add up to devastating consequences for the global poor. So I think his criticism of the interactional model of human rights violations when it comes to thinking about severe poverty is a powerful one. But I think where his argument is less plausible is with his institutional account of responsibility, which singles out one actually pretty small group of individuals, official agents of the global institutional order, and says that the decisions these individuals make in their official capacity within an authoritative decision-making structure are predictably structure agents' behavior in a way that leads to the infliction of severe poverty. And that's going to be extremely contentious. I think a more plausible picture of the patterns of behavior that lead to the infliction of severe poverty is going to be a kind of evolutionary analysis of the emergence and staying power of certain norms. On this alternative conception of a structural violation, you simply don't need the assumption that you can actually pinpoint specific intentional policy decisions that are plausibly describable as inflicting severe poverty. Okay, so on to the alternative analysis of severe poverty as a structural human rights violation. Just want to step back a minute and just remind you of the two criteria I mentioned for a plausible account of a human rights violation. One is that it captures the special peremptory moral force of the concept, right? The notion of a human rights violator designates someone that's acted in a way that falls beneath the minimal moral threshold that constitutes the morality of the depths, each person's minimum reasonable demand against the rest of humanity. The duty to avoid a human rights violation has a great deal of moral force, trumps considerations such as domestic self-interest, and it is rightfully enforced. So you want an account that captures the moral force of violations, but at the same time, as I mentioned, you shouldn't arbitrarily rule out the possibility that the notion of a human rights violation could be applicable to these extremely complicated social interactions that are a feature of our contemporary global context. Okay, so I'll first mention some of the salient features of our contemporary social context, and then I'll argue for a set of sufficient conditions for constituting a human rights violation. Okay, well, one particularly important feature of our contemporary social context is that much of our lives are governed by very complicated bureaucratic structures which feature a division of labor, right? So people have a particular role, responsibility within an organization, and so on. And another core feature of our contemporary global context is that our actions can have global consequences to people that we never encounter and might not even think about. So one of the dangers of this division of labor is that people are going to focus on fulfilling their individual role responsibility or conforming to the culture of the business that employs them and so on, without taking personal responsibility for the bigger picture, the combined effect of everyone else fulfilling their role responsibility and so on. So one explanation of the persistence of severe poverty is that business cultures, not surprisingly, tend to be dominated by the pursuit of profit maximization and promoting the economic interests of the business and its shareholders. And their individual employees are focusing on conforming to that business culture and so on. But the same division of labor also applies at the global level, where governments take to be their primary role responsibility to be promoting the domestic economic growth of their democratic, the people they're democratically accountable to, but currently not obviously globally accountable. And in conjunction with this, I think actually one of the main problems with global social institutions is the lack of adequate coercive enforcement mechanisms that could rein in these powerful economic actors in a way that would protect the global poor. Right, so Pogge has a picture according to which you have these momentous policy decisions which are then coercively imposed on the global poor, and the patterns of behavior that lead to severe poverty can be traced back to these decisions. But an alternative picture is you just have these, quotidian decisions by administrators to conform to a directive that's going to maximize domestic economic growth and so on. So individual countries are promoting their economic interest, and same with individual corporations and so on. And the agents that are charged with scrutinizing and regulating the bigger picture, agents of the IMF, the World Bank, and so on, lack any enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the combined effect is not severely detrimental to the global poor. So I take a different lesson from study of the Holocaust, looking at, Hannah Arendt's discussion of rule by nobody, right, where you have, where it's actually not possible to single out any person as individually fully responsible for the severe harms inflicted on particular individuals. Because of the nature of bureaucracy, division of labor, and so on. Now, of course, there's one fundamental disparallel in that the Holocaust at the institutional level could not have been more deliberate and intentional. But even there, the actual harm that was done went beyond what was intended by many of the individual participants. When you think about the doctors that told themselves they were just filling in a medical questionnaire and just denied any personal responsibility for the fact that this was actually tantamount to a death warrant, and so on. So on this account of structural violations, you don't need the assumption that the patterns of behavior can be attributed to specific intentional policy decisions. You just look straight at the combined effects of the ongoing patterns of behavior and look at whether those effects are acceptable and justifiable. Okay, so on to, and I'll argue that no, they actually meet the sufficient conditions for constituting a human rights violation. Okay, so on to those sufficient conditions. And my goal here is to give an account that's so morally minimal that rejection of it just can't credibly be held to be compatible with minimally adequate recognition of each person's moral status, the universal dignity of persons, which is affirmed in the preamble to all the contemporary human rights documents. So if you take fundamental human rights to be rock-bottom moral claims of paramount moral importance held by each person simply in virtue of their moral status as a person, they constitute claims not to be treated in ways that is just fundamentally incompatible with minimally adequate recognition of that moral status. Now, of course, there's a huge amount of debate about what grounds the universal moral status of persons and what kinds of treatment is fundamentally incompatible with minimally adequate recognition of that moral status. But I take it to be uncontroversial that a sufficient condition for constituting such treatment is that the treatment predictably, avoidably, and unjustifiably inflicts devastating harms, the kinds of harms that are liable to blight or altogether destroy your life. I'm hoping that the claim that the unjustifiable infliction of this kind of ruinous suffering constitutes a human rights violation is uncontroversial to the point of having an air of tautology, right? So again, that brings us to a more controversial question in what constitutes the unjustifiable infliction of ruinous suffering. But I also take it to be uncontroversial that the infliction of severe harm is unjustifiable if the harms are both foreseeable and could be avoided at moderate economic cost to every duty bearer. Right, so there are no really weighty moral considerations that might, in this particular case, justify the infliction of the harm. The only reason the harms are continuing to be inflicted is that that's profitable to other agents. Okay, so I take it that inflicting ruinous harm that blights or destroys people's lives when you could avoid doing so at a mere profit reduction or a mere moderate economic cost is fundamentally incompatible with minimally adequate recognition of the moral value of those persons' lives. And I want to appeal here to James Griffin's notion of, the discarding of people's lives is just not treating them as having any value. Okay, so I hope that captures the special moral force of the notion of a human rights violation. But notice that it's not confined to any particular social context. You can actually apply it directly to ongoing patterns of behavior themselves. Okay, so this is the bottom of page 3 on the handout. If it's reasonably foreseeable that the combined effect of certain aspects of ongoing patterns of behavior is the infliction of extremely severe harms, and there are feasible and feasibly achievable alternative social structures under which the harms could be avoided at moderate economic cost, and there are no countervailing moral considerations that could justify the infliction of the harms, then the agents who participate in the structures are under a shared duty of basic justice to implement those reforms in order to avoid the harms. And this duty is underpinned by the abstract general duty of justice, which is held by everyone and owed to everyone, not to discard people's lives. So if you're involved in social structures that have this predictable effect, then you have some share of a duty to take the steps needed to avoid those harms. Failure to implement that shared duty and allowing the harms to continue constitutes a structural violation, and the reason for that is the nature of the trade-offs the patterns themselves instantiate, which amounts to the discarding of people's lives. Right, so whereas POGA takes the nature of the violation to consist in these decisions that are plausibly describable as inflicting severe poverty, I take the nature of the violation to basically consist in just the sheer disparity between the level of global resources and the fact that some people are being deprived of even the basic necessities of life, which could be so cheaply avoided that it amounts to the discarding of their lives. Okay, so to defend this account of a human rights violation, let's think about the two main accounts that have been given of the function of fundamental human rights. One of them, the principal accounts that's been given, is that their role is to protect people's basic interests against standard threats to those basic interests. Where a standard threat is a threat that's reasonably common and feasibly eradicable at reasonable social cost. Well, clearly structural violations pose actually a constant threat to the basic interests of a vast number. And it's built into my notion of a human rights violation that this is feasibly eradicable at reasonable social cost. And there's one respect in which structural violations are even worse than traditional human rights violations, and that's that some people from the very outset face this actual and ongoing threat to their basic interests from the time they're born, or even before they're born in the case of mothers that suffer malnutrition. So some people's lives are predictably destined to drastically stunted, impoverished life or premature death. So if human rights are there to protect us against the most common threats to our basic interests, this ought to constitute a human rights violation. The other main account that's been given of the role of fundamental human rights is to express and affirm each person's moral status. So this is a more sort of Kantian deontological account of human rights. Affirming a human right publicly expresses that each person has this equal fundamental moral status. Conversely, not recognizing what actually is a fundamental human right has the effect of relegating some individuals to an inferior social status. Now, a really blatant example of this, of course, was slave-owning societies where the laws of the societies actually classified some human beings as property. But I think there's a much more kind of subtle and insidious way of failing to recognize a fundamental human right. And that's to, officially recognize the human right, but then not actually identify the kinds of behavior that constitutes a human rights violation, and not classify any of the behavior that actually leads people to come to be deprived of the object of that right as a human rights violation. So the laws and rules and so on allow some people to be deprived of the means of subsistence, and there's no official recognition that they've been wronged. Okay. I think a third way of justifying this account of a human rights violation is to think about a commonly held account of the role of laws, which is to regulate social interactions in a way that makes sure that people's pursuit of their role responsibility actually serves the common good. So presumably a minimal account of adequate laws is that they make sure that people's fulfillment of their individual role responsibility doesn't predictably and avoidably lead to extremely severe harms to individuals. Okay, so just running through features of and finally, another reason that's motivating this analysis is that the classic perpetrator model, where you single out particular individuals as the perpetrators of a violation in virtue of some harmful action they've done or some specific policy decision they've made, actually functions as a massive moral loophole on my analysis, because it allows powerful corporations and so on to continue maximizing profit without any regard for the overall impact of their behavior, and without any either official recognition or perhaps recognizing themselves that this constitutes a human rights violation. So some people have argued that the perpetrator model doesn't fit, and therefore the persistence of severe poverty shouldn't be classified as a human rights violation. I'm trying to argue for the different conclusion that we ought to move away from the perpetrator model towards looking at structures themselves. But I should emphasize that the relevant notion of liability for structural violations is going to be very different than the notion that's applicable in traditional paradigmatic human rights violations. Right, normally, we respond to our outrage at a human rights violation by feeling outrage at the perpetrator. And the relevant notion of liability is both is individualizing. It singles out particular perpetrators. It's backward-looking. It looks at what they did, and if they're found guilty, then punishment is considered appropriate. The account of liability that I think is relevant to structural violations is a forward-looking notion that if you're about to be agents that would otherwise be part of a structural human rights violation, are liable to the economic costs of the measures needed to avoid that violation, simply in the sense that they can't reasonably reject that economic cost. So it's rightfully enforced. I think the main role of structural violations is actually to question and undermine the legitimacy of laws and structures that allow them. So it does challenge existing structures of power, but you're talking about a kind of regulative economic cost to prevent a structural violation from occurring. There actually needn't be any presumption of blame whatsoever. I mean, I think another important role of structural violations is to serve as a kind of coordination point for agitation and reform and so on, and give people a leverage to demand of their governments that they do regulate people's behavior in a way that doesn't have this impact on the global poor. So most advocates of looking at severe poverty as a structural injustice say the notion of violations is completely inapplicable because we don't want to think about liability and guilt and so on. And I think that overlooks another notion of liability, which is this forward-looking, shared, regulative liability to implement the structural reforms needed to avoid the continuation of these harms. And unlike the the Young's kind of model, I think the enforcement is crucial. Okay, so just to outline some of the features of structural violations, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so one of the points of the category of structural violations is to bring moral and juridical scrutiny to bear directly on these combined effects of ongoing patterns of behavior. Another feature of structural violations is, unlike the institutional account, the fundamental duty bearers are ultimately individual agents, because the duty to bring about structural reform is underpinned by this universal duty not to discard people's lives. But unlike the interactional account, claims against structural violations are not claims against the behavior of each considered one by one. I mean, to even have a grasp of structural violations, you've got to focus on the combined effect of your behavior in conjunction with the behavior of other agents. So it's different from both the institutional and the interactional account. And as I mentioned, they serve as a coordination point for agitation and reform. So whereas the institutional account is a top-down model where ultimate responsibility lies with these official agents who are coercively imposing specific policies, this is going to be a network model. We have a complex interdependence between formal laws and common mores and so on. And as social scientists tell us, fundamental institutional reforms only happen when there's a transformative shift in social norms anyway, so that normal practices are actually recognized as harmful. And actually that fits an interesting move in law towards this liability model when it comes to, toxic torts for factories that are together causing a very dangerous level of pollution, but of course none of the factories in isolation can be singled out as responsible for a severe harm to anyone. Okay, and finally, applying this to severe poverty, this is the argument that it meets those sufficient conditions. Okay, so severe poverty clearly does blight or destroy the lives of millions. Much of it should be attributed to violations of the negative duty not to deprive people of the means of subsistence. Right? It's always important to bear in mind it's not a natural phenomenon. It's people being deprived of economic opportunities and entitlements and so on. Responsibility of this violation isn't plausibly confined to the right holder's own government. So here I'm being neutral about how you divide up the responsibility between domestic and global social institutions, which is where Pogge's argument has been completely dismissed. And then turning to the positive duty, if we are to retain the peremptory moral force of the notion of a violation, then the positive duty has to be a practicable demand, in which case it has to be a claim against global institutions and the international community. Turning to the feasibility, given the overall level of global resources, there are feasible and feasibly achievable institutionally specified and enforced schemas of regulations and duties, compliance with which would avoid severe poverty at moderate cost to every duty bearer. There are no countervailing moral considerations that could justify the infliction of the harm. And so our ongoing shared failure to have implemented such a schema constitutes a structural violation. I'll stop there.